In this video, I'm going to offer you 5 tips for transitioning from beginner to intermediate yoga classes. Hi, I'm Melissa from Yoga with Melissa. I've been teaching yoga since 2002, online since 2009, and my beginner yoga classes have been very popular. This past spring, I offered a 30-day yoga challenge of beginner yoga classes on my main channel. When Rita finished that challenge, she asked me, how do I transition from beginners to intermediate classes? So there are different ways that we can advance our practice. We can think about physically, mentally, emotionally, energetically, and spiritually, but we tend to only think about getting better at the yoga poses. This is being the only way that we can advance our practice, but there's so many different ways that our yoga practice advances. The important thing to remember is that every body is different and every skeletal structure is unique. We may walk into a beginner yoga class being able to do lotus pose, but not being able to touch our toes. And there could be certain skeletal limitations in our bodies that mean that we'll never be able to touch our toes. So I would say getting good at the physical yoga postures is the last reason why I would recommend transitioning from beginner to intermediate yoga classes. For me, I would say the most important thing I would want my students to consider when they're moving from beginner to intermediate is whether they're mentally ready. So as a teacher, the main difference I'm considering when I'm designing a beginner yoga video versus an intermediate yoga video is the level of knowledge that I believe my students will be bringing. Thus, the amount of instructions and cueing that I'll be giving them through the class. So in a beginner level class, I'm giving a lot of step-by-step instructions on how to get into the pose. I'm offering a lot of modifications. I'm showing a lot of modifications. I'm not going to assume that a beginner level student will know alternatives, that they'll have props. And oftentimes, I'm only going to give a regressed version of the posture. For example, personally, I'm only going to offer recline figure 4 pose to stretch the glutes in a beginner class. I don't ever get into pigeon pose in a beginner class. I also steer away from seated forward folds and only offer standing forward folds, which are so much easier for beginners. So my first tip, if you're considering moving from a beginner level class to an intermediate level class, is that you have solid knowledge of the foundational poses of yoga. That is, you know the basics like how to do knee to chest pose, figure 4 pose, cat pose, lunge pose, child's pose, down dog, mountain pose, chair pose, warrior poses, standing forward folds, twists, simple back bends, legs up the wall, shavasana. I'm sure I've left some out, so let me know in the comments. But you need to have familiarity with these basic poses and also how to modify them if they're challenging for you, which brings me to my second tip. Number 2, if you're considering moving from a beginner to an intermediate level class, you need to be familiar with modifications. So for example, if you're in cat pose and it bothers your wrists and your knees, you need to remember from your beginner classes other ways that you can do cat pose that doesn't bother your wrist and your knees. In a good class, the yoga teacher may verbally cue alternatives, but they might not always have time to show alternatives. My third tip is that you need to know that there are props, you need to have props, and you need to know how to use them. So for example, if you're in a balancing posture and you're struggling with your balance, you need to know that you can hold onto a chair or a wall and support yourself with props, even if the teacher doesn't offer that. If you're in child's pose and your knees and ankles hurt, you need to either know an alternative or how to prop it so that it's not injurious to your body. When I teach beginner classes, I rarely use props because I assume that my students won't have them yet. And when I teach intermediate classes, I assume that my students will have props and I use them a lot. Before I move on to my fourth tip, would you mind pressing that like button and subscribing to my channel? Thank you so much. It helps me out a lot. Also put these 5 tips are great in the comments and share any of your own. Let me know if you have any unanswered questions about transitioning from beginner to intermediate classes when we're done, because I'm happy to answer your questions in the comments and maybe even make another video. My fourth tip is that you need to look after your body. Can you pay attention to your own body and listen to its internal cues from the inside rather than to create a shape based on what something looks like on the outside or in a video, which could potentially cause an injury? So for example, if the teacher is leading everybody into a headstand, do you go along for the ride no matter what? Or do you listen to your body and do something else because you know you have a history of whiplash? This is a pretty extreme example, but subtler versions of this happen all the time in yoga classes, and you need to be able to listen to the cues of your own body and discern what the teacher is asking of you, if it's working for you on any level, whether that's physically, mentally, emotionally, energetically, or spiritually. My fifth tip is that you need to be connected with your own inner sovereignty and recognize that you are always your own best teacher. Yes, we can learn things from our yoga teachers, but never should we blindly hand our power over to them. We have to be willing to ask for help when we're struggling and not simply do what they ask without always checking in with how it's working for us. There's a level of discernment that opens up to us as we move from beginner to intermediate to advanced students that allows us to open into a dialogue with our teacher about our needs. So if you like this video, you're probably going to like my video, 6 ways to know when you're ready for an intermediate yoga practice. In it, I share things that I didn't share in this video, and I'll have it linked on the screen and down below.